I'm responding to the claim that animal testing is cruel and not effective. My opponent's secondary claims were that animal testing takes advantage of animals. And two, that results of animal tests are not accurate, and animal testing is wasteful. To respond to her first claim, I think that it's, first of all, it's not a claim of fact, it's a claim of value. What is deemed as taking advantage is subjective and open to interpretation by each individual. Not everyone has the same standard for what is considered taking advantage. So she said that testing removes animals from their environment, and animals are not removed from their environment because they're not taken from the wild to be tested on. They're usually kept in captivity from birth. She also said that animals cognitively feel pain and emotion, and while that is true, it can be comparable to any other type of animal that is kept in captivity. They all feel pain and emotion, so the morality there would be open to interpretation again by each person. To respond to her second claim, the context of the statistics that she gave for her claim, the context of it wasn't given, and it is pretty essential to show whether the tests on animals are accurate or not. First of all, animal tests are not meant to replace humans. She said that animals do not have the same biological makeup as humans, and therefore animal tests are not beneficial to showing whether the drugs tested on them are useful for humans or not. But animal testing is meant to decrease the amount of drugs that move on to following trials that later move on to FDA approval. So animal testing isn't really meant to show whether the drugs tested on them are actually going to have the same results on humans or not. According to understandinganimalresearch.org, the role of preclinical animal tests is to check if the drug offers any potential therapeutic value, and more importantly, if it is safe enough to move on to phase 1 trials in humans. That means that they're just tested on them to see whether the drugs can actually go on to human testing and not be toxic and kill the humans right away. So, yeah, to respond to her third claim, animal testing is the contrary of wasteful when its purpose is taken into account. Now, knowing that animal testing is only meant to test drugs for humans, there are also preliminary tests to animal testing that are used on cells and on other simulated computer tests and virtual testing. So before it even goes on to animal testing, many drugs are already not taken into account. And there are stages that the drugs go through. 88% still don't pass on to FDA approval after they are tested on animals. According again to understandinganimalresearch.com, animal experiments remove 36% of the potential drugs from moving on to the next stage. So they're actually eliminating waste by not making all drugs be tested on humans. If they didn't have animal testing and all the drugs were tested on humans right away, then first of all, it would harm many humans because the toxicity levels would be much greater on the drugs that are tested on humans. And many more drugs would have to be tested instead of having those 36 eliminated. She also says that in her claim, she says that there are more alternatives being developed instead of animal testing. And the example she gave was in vitro human skin equivalent was created to directly mimic all the characteristics of human skin. And while this is true, in vitro testing is not a viable option for all the types of tests that are done with animals. According to the National Institute of Environmental Health, no single in vitro test method is currently available to serve all regulatory needs for a specific testing area. In some areas, such as identification of severe eye irritants and substances that could cause allergic contact, major progress has been made in reducing and replacing animal use. For other hazards, such as identification of substances that can cause cancer or birth defects, development of in vitro tests that reliably identify hazards are more difficult to use because the number of different mechanisms involved in these complex biological processes. So in vitro testing can't be used to identify the more hazardous diseases that are prevalent in humans, and that's why animals are needed for those things. So to recap, I'm countering the claim that animal tests are cruel and not effective by saying that the context of the statistics used to prove her claim were not given, and they're very essential to showing whether the statistics apply or not. And animal testing is a contrary of wasteful when you take into account what animal testing is actually used for.
All right, the structure is fine. The first point challenges whether or not it's a claim of fact and deals with the value issue, and I think that that's a reasonable press on that particular point. I think you could use an illustration on that point to show why people might be perceiving these things a little bit differently. I liked your argument about captive breeding, although I do think you need some evidence on that particular point. And the notion that it's equivalent to anything else that other animals might be suffering from, that's a moral equivalency argument, which is okay to make if we're going to argue the value point, but you're trying to dismiss that from the beginning. So I think it's fine to make in this particular context. I don't know that it's a key point that we have to worry about. Your next argument I thought was interesting because it gives us a context for the way research is being done and how the procedure works, which I thought was a very good explanation that frequently gets ignored in this process, that the animals are not really designed to replace humans, that they are part of a series of processes that people go through, and that the goal is to reduce testing that's going to be either unnecessary or particularly dangerous. I thought that that was an effective response to the advocate's point there, and there's some evidence that comes up in the advocate's argument that is answered by this particular issue. I seem to remember one of those statistics that talked about how many drugs don't get through or don't get approved, and you have an explanation about part of the reason why they're not getting approved, and I thought that was pretty effective in putting things into the context that you're talking about. That you did mostly on your contrasting argument on the third point, which I thought was pretty clear. The virtual testing issue, I think you could use a little bit more evidence on, but you did have a nice argument down below on the in vitro argument, and you developed it very effectively, and you've got a nice summary statement on that point. All right, thank you.